tools for sleep enhancement.
Mm.
So let's go there.
So I think many people may have heard of some of the conventional, but what about the unconventional? I would probably offer 5 or 6. The first one I would say is that if you are struggling with sleep and you have had a bad night of sleep, the first recommendation is do nothing. And what I mean by that is if you've had a bad night of sleep, you're awake for 3 hours, do not sleep in any later into the morning. Do not go to bed any earlier. Do not increase your caffeine intake to try to offset it, and do not nap during the day. Why am I telling you those things? If you wake up later that following morning, your adenosine clock that we've spoken about, this building up of sleepiness that happens when we wake up, is going to start later in the day. So when it comes time for you to fall asleep at what would then be the next night at your normal time, you're not going to feel as sleepy. Why? Because you woke up that much later and you're setting yourself up for failure again. Equally, don't go to bed any earlier. If you have become accustomed, and your brain has, and your circadian clock has become accustomed to going to bed at a certain time, and hopefully you're doing it regularly, then getting into bed 2 or 3 hours early has the danger, it's not a certainty, but a danger of you then getting into bed and thinking, well, I know I had a bad night of sleep last night, but I still can't fall asleep straight away. So now you're spending another 90 minutes in bed at the beginning because you've gone to bed 90 minutes earlier thinking it's a good idea to compensate. Don't do that either. Hold out, even if you do feel tired. My recommendation would be after that bad night of sleep, hold out for as long as you can, as close to your natural bedtime as possible. Then go to sleep and you will give yourself highest chance of success. Don't overcaffeinate. That's the obvious one. Follow the beautiful Huberman taper. And then obviously try not to compensate with a nap. Why? Because that nap, as happens when we sleep, is going to remove some of that sleepiness, that adenosine. And once again, you get into bed and you're not as sleepy as you would naturally be. So you again go through a bad night because you're struggling to sleep, or you wake up and you can't get back because you've got less weight of sleepiness on your shoulders due to the nap that happened earlier. So I know it's hard, but I would say when the alarm goes off after a bad night, you just think, I do not want to get up. It's been such a rough night. I know it's a short-term gain, but trust me, it's a long-term loss because you're going to then just get into this vicious cycle. So that's the first unconventional tip.
Can I just pause you for a second? I'm a little wide-eyed over here because I did not know any of that. Typically, if I get a poor night's sleep, I'll do whatever I can to recover that sleep.
Yeah.
Take a nap. I'll adjust my to bedtime the next evening. So I hope everyone is paying careful attention to what Matt just said. I mean, that's a important list because I think one of the very common things is for people to just not get a great night's sleep. And I think most people think, okay, I'll drink a little more caffeine. I will go to bed a little earlier tonight. Maybe catch a nap in the afternoon, this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I would have thought that too, and maybe even suggested that. And if you listen to the first episode and where I list in a doomsday manner the things that can happen by way of a short night, you would think that that's what I would then recommend. But it was really imprinted on me by a wonderful sleep clinician, Michael Perlis, who sort of described some of these features and exactly the reasons sort of underlying them. And I think I've just tried to bake that out into a formula that makes sense. Again, it's not about the rule, it's about explaining it, because when you explain it, at first it sounds contradictory and paradoxical. When you understand it, it hopefully sounds logical and actionable. So that would be the first suggestion.
Could I just, sorry to interrupt again.
No, please,
my audience hates when I interrupt, but I'm doing it on their behalf because
I love it.
Because I like to think that there's some value in some of at least what you say in response. I saw a really terrific post from Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who we both know and admire for her public health education work. And she described a study whereby if people are, I think it was slightly sleep deprived, maybe by a few hours, that some of the disruption to morning blood glucose regulation that is known to accompany partial sleep deprivation, and certainly complete sleep deprivation, but in this case, partial sleep deprivation could be offset by still exercising in the morning.
That's right.
Which, frankly, I have to say, if I haven't slept that well, then, normally I'm like, oh, maybe today's the day I don't exercise. But now, having heard that information, I make it a point to still exercise, sometimes with a little bit less intensity.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be completely exhausted in the afternoon, and go to sleep at 4 p.m. or something, really disrupt my schedule. But I thought that was really interesting because it's a sort of partial inoculation of the blood glucose disruption caused by sleep deprivation.
I'm so glad you brought it up. It's a fantastic study, and Rhonda and I think even tried to discuss it some years ago on a show, but I like it because it does offer some degree of actionable hope and a strategy. Blood sugar, absolutely critical. It is very sensitive to sleep. When you don't get enough, it goes in bad directions. You used a very specific word, cleverly so, and that word was partially. At first you hear or read that study, and Rhonda was never suggesting this too, I'm not saying that. You think, well, if it offsets blood sugar, and the study was saying exercise can nullify a lack of sleep, you conflate that single outcome benefit with the idea that, well, but maybe it doesn't actually or does it compensate for the deficits in immune function or cardiovascular disease concerns or my hormonal health or my learning and memory or my emotional and brain health. Maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't. So I think I would always just caution people to saying, when you hear a study like that, it's very natural to think, oh, that must mean that it translates to everything else in my body and everything else in my brain. It may, but it also may not be.
Terrific. So if you don't sleep that well, do your best to still get some exercise, but just
Yep.
be mindful of the fact that, in the winter months, especially, that might, if you go too hard in the gym or on a run, you might be a little bit immune compromised. Just be mindful of the fact that you're a more vulnerable being when you're sleep deprived, but that exercise can help adjust things in the right direction. And if it's early in the day, presumably that's not going to disrupt the proper bedtime. And if it's later in the day, I suppose, as long as you don't need caffeine in order to do that exercise, and or if you're familiar with exercising later in the day, fine. I find if I exercise, I'm not one of these people that can go for a run at 7 o'clock at night and then just shower and go to sleep.
Because you're a morning type.
Because I'm a morning type. Other
Correct.
people can. Okay,
Yep.
we'll get into exercise a bit more in a later episode.
We should do. Yep.
We'll be sure to do that, but nonetheless, just raise that now. So what are some of the other unconventional episodes?
We should do. Yep.
We'll be sure to do that, but nonetheless, just raise that now. So what are some of the other unconventional protocols for sleep?
So I think other suggestions I would have after do nothing would be try to think about limiting your time in bed. If you are struggling with sleep, this is something that is used in probably the most well-validated psychological intervention for insomnia, and it's called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI for short. What happens is that you work with a clinician, they interview you, they assess all of the reasons that you may not be sleeping, and then they create from their toolbox of many different options a bespoke, tailored sort of Savile Row soup prescription for you for your treatment. If you look at the studies of that collection of different tools in the CBTI box for intervention of insomnia, and you ask, of all of those, which seems to carry the greatest impact on insomnia, which has the greatest sort of gravitas? It seems to be this thing that we call bedtime rescheduling. It used to be known as sleep restriction therapy, but obviously, if you come to me and you say, look, I'm not sleeping very well, I've got insomnia, I say, I understand, and I've got a treatment for you. It's called sleep restriction therapy. And you say, no, you didn't understand. I'm not getting enough sleep. But it's not quite that. Here's how it works. If you are spending so much time in bed, too much time in bed, you are not forcing your brain to be efficient. And by way of constraining your sleep window, even to, let's say, 5 hours a night to begin with, I brute force ruthless efficiency from your sleeping brain after several days. So another analogy would be, let's say you're trying to make a nice thin crust of pizza base, and you put the dough on the table and you start rolling it out. If you roll it too thin, it starts to get gaps and holes in it. Why? Because you've spread it out too far and you've started to create these absences. That's the same thing that happens. And it's very natural. As an insomnia patient, you would say, I'm just not getting enough sleep, so I'm going to start spending more time in bed. It's the very worst idea. Another way would be to say, look, I go to the gym and I spend about an hour and a half working out. But if I were to videotape you, a lot of people are doing I think I've coined it as your phrase, but the 11th rep, where people, do the 10 reps, and then all of a sudden there's the selfie or there's the social media.
Yeah.
And
the texting, they finish the last rep, put it down, and then
straight away
immediately
on
to
the
their
text.
phone.
And if you look, they're only working out for about, let's say, 45 minutes, and the other is wasted. So what if the next day you came to the gym and I said, look, I'm sorry, and there's some big bouncer guys at the door. You are only allowed to work out for 40 minutes, and then we're going to eject you. And the first day, you go back and you do the same thing. And then you've only got through 30% of your workout. So you get booted. The next day, you come back and you do a little bit more and you get booted again. After about 5 or 6 days, you've built up such a strong desire and hunger to get your workout in. You walk in, you put your phone on silent, you put it over in the corner, and you just get to it. And that's the same thing that we're trying to do with sleep restriction therapy. So you have to be a little bit careful, do it under supervision, especially if you're driving or you're operating heavy machinery. We just want to keep an eye. It's not necessarily a big concern, but we would say, okay, Andrew, you're currently spending almost total about 8-ish or 7.5 hours in bed. Tonight, I'm going to restrict you down to 5 hours a night, and we're going to do this for the next week. And the way that we normally do it is I don't change your wake up time. I change your to bed time. Why? It's easier to stay awake longer than it is to wake up earlier. So I put it on the front end, the compromise. And at first, things don't change. But after maybe about 4 or 5 days of going through this, I build up enough of a short-term debt in your system that your system all of a sudden thinks, gosh, I just cannot be as lazy anymore. I can't do this thing of waking up in the middle of the night and spending an hour and a half awake. I don't have the choice anymore. There's so much physiological buildup and pressure to do this. And gradually what happens is that you sleep longer, you don't wake up as much. And after maybe about 2 weeks of doing this, all of a sudden you go to bed at this later time. So for you, let's say you normally go to bed at 8, I'm going to have you go to bed at maybe 10:30, 11, but we're still going to have you wake up at that sort of 4:30 a.m. mark that you would normally wake up. And all of a sudden you go to bed at 10:30, 11, you're out like a light. And then again, the next thing you remember is your alarm going off saying, I'm sorry, you've got to wake up. And what happens by way of that reset is gradually we will then, once you're stable, we will start to back it off. We'll start to have you go to bed at 10. And if it stays stable, then 9:45, then 9:30, and titrate you back to where you were. And if there's any sign that you're starting to not sleep well, we zip it back up again. The goal here is in some ways almost like hitting the reset button on your Wi-Fi router. I'm trying to retrain your brain to better sleep. Because when you are not sleeping well, you've lost your confidence in your ability to sleep. And when I do this technique with you, gradually your system and you cognitively relearn that you are a good sleeper and you can trust in sleep. And now your sleep does not control you. You control your sleep. The hard part, however, is that it's not easy to go through. And we have to usually ask 2 questions with individuals. Firstly, what is your motivation for better sleep? We need to know that you really are motivated. And then second, You just stay with a high touch white glove frequency, checking in on individuals and motivating them to keep going, because it's very easy to fall off the wagon. So that's the next suggestion: sleep restriction therapy, or bedtime rescheduling, as we would call it.
You said it's difficult for people to go through. It takes a little bit of rigor, a little bit of attention, means in some cases getting less sleep than one would like. But as compared to something that, sadly I've experienced a lot in my life, of having challenges with sleep and trying to get things back in order and looking at the bed and just going, oh my God, battleground, battleground, it's, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I love the analogy to the gym. Somehow, if there's a restriction to 1 hour in and out the door, or maybe 70 minutes in and out the door because you need to put your stuff in a locker or something like that, it always, at least for me, gets done best when you just have those constraints. I think there's something about the human brain that we don't do well in unrestrained systems, that I really think guardrails are fantastic. I love deadlines, for instance.
Yeah, discipline is essentially the
hard deadlines, or as they say in academia, because we write grants all the time, drop deadlines.
Yeah.
Which who made up that term? But if you don't make it, that's it. It's like there isn't a, hey, I'll send this in tomorrow. 5 p.m. Pacific time, that website closes, and better
boy,
have
do you get things done all of a sudden. It's
amazing.
Surprising how much distraction you can, pull out the noise and focus on the signal. It's great signal to noise ratio.
Yeah, and I love the idea that one can control their sleep as opposed to sleep controlling them. I think that's and this notion of sleep confidence, and one's confidence in their ability to sleep. These are important terms, and they're more than just terms, because I think that a field and an area of health practice, and gosh, what's more important than sleep? It's the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance, period. Really thrives on a common nomenclature, and I really appreciate that you're peppering these episodes with new nomenclature that captures a lot of the essence of the protocols and the mechanisms. So that's my editorial. Please continue.
I would say that in terms of other things, maybe just to go through them a little more quickly.
Editorial. Please continue.
I would say that in terms of other things, maybe just to go through them a little more quickly. We've spoken some about a wind down routine. Most people underappreciate the importance of a wind down routine. We often think that sleep is like a light bulb, that we dive into bed, we switch off the light bulb, and sleep should appear just as quickly. It's untrue. Sleep, in terms of a process, is much more physiologically like trying to land a plane. It just takes time to come down onto the terra firma of good sleep at night. Whatever it is you enjoy as a relaxation method, engage in it. It could be listening to a podcast, it could be reading a book, maybe it's a meditation, it's light stretching, maybe whatever it is that you do, just build it into your regimen. You would never, be driving down the road and then pull into your garage at the same 40-mile-an-hour speed. You gradually decelerate and you come to a stop. It's the same thing with sleep. So you need to find some way to decelerate. And we've spoken about methods already as to how to do that. The next tip is a little quirky and funny. Do not count sheep. There's a great study from my colleague, Dr. Alison Harvey at UC Berkeley, and she put this to the test. It didn't make people fall asleep faster. It made them take longer to fall asleep. However, she did find an alternative. If you are not into meditation or podcasts or sleep stories or whatever it is that you wish for, try taking yourself on a mental walk. And it has to be a walk that you know very well. So let's say that you walk your dog every day and there's a couple of walks that you take with your dog. Do it in hyper detail. So close your eyes, you go to the front door, you clip in the dog to the leash, you walk out, you go down the steps, out to the driveway, then you take a right, but you always cross over and you look to the left and the right because that's the place where traffic always comes. You cross over and now you're walking up and there's that strange sort of set of garbage that's been outside of that house for a long time and you don't know why it hasn't been cleared. And then you move. That type of high fidelity detail allows you to do what we said earlier, which is get your mind off itself. And when you do that, again, typically you fall asleep faster. And that's what she found. It was a great, great study. I really enjoyed that.
I'm curious as to why it works so well. And I'm not challenging that it works. I can imagine, having just closed my eyes and kind of imagine what that would be like. It's very pleasant. Um, there might be, and here I'm just speculating, something about engaging one's procedural memory, because that's procedural memory. You're trying to remember how you do something, as opposed to declarative memory, which is about facts. I remember this and this is going to happen tomorrow. I wonder whether or not there's something about using a procedural memory as opposed to a declarative memory visualization. Somebody should do that study.
They should, and I think it's certainly possible that when you're incorporating some aspect, some aspects of the scene and the information is more sort of veridical and maybe sort of episodic declarative memory. But when you're taking yourself for a mental walk, what is the fundamental premise of that? It's a walk, it's motion, it's procedural memory. And so maybe it's something to do with being more attentive to becoming embodied, because when you're out walking and you're moving, it is a more embodied experience than just sitting there at your desk, which is mostly your head and very little your body. So I think it's an intriguing idea. And I think another tip that I now think of, which also comes from the work of Dr. Alison Harvey, when individuals come up to me after sort of public events, or they see me at the airport, they'll say, look, every night, for some strange reason, at 2:45 a.m., I wake up, and it happens 3 or 4 nights a week. My first question to them is, how do you know it's 2:45? And they say, well, I look at the clock, or I look at my phone. Best piece of advice next: remove all clock faces from the bedroom. No matter how bad your sleep is going to be that night, knowing what time it is only going to make matters worse. It is not going to make matters any better. And that can create an anxiety trigger that you think, it's 2:45. And then you're tossing and turning, you look back at the clock, and now it's 3:14 a.m. And you think, I've got to be awake at 6. I've got that big meeting. And now it's 5:20. Don't do that to yourself. And even though I don't typically struggle with sleep, I have no clock faces in my bedroom. The phone that I use to help do the guided meditation is an old phone, and it has only Wi-Fi connectivity and nothing else on it. And I will only hit play, and then I will never turn it around. I will not look at the clock face. Just doesn't help me.
Another incentive for keeping the phone out of the room, if one can. I understand there are reasons when one would want the phone in the room if, it's potentially signaling an emergency.
Well, I think it's a very important point, and we've done some work in this area too. What that phone does is create a low level of anxiety. It's what we call anticipatory anxiety. One of the mechanisms separate from that, well, it's related to that. If you look at teen phone use, one of the reasons that they don't sleep very well at night is that they're constantly checking their phones because of FOMO, a fear of missing out. What has gone on as I've been asleep? And it's stunning, the data. But for most adults, the other reason I don't like advocating for phone use, when your alarm goes off in the morning, what is the first thing that you do as you're in bed? You swipe right, or you unlock your phone, and you instantly start checking social media, emails, text messages. And this tsunami of stress and anxiety just floods over you. It hits you like this wall of anxiety. And I bring this up because it again trains your brain for expectation of that. Anticipatory anxiety has a consequence on your sleep, and everyone knows this. Let's say that you've booked an early morning flight, and you've got to wake up at 5 a.m. when normally you wake up at 7 a.m. two things will usually happen. First, you know that you're just not going to sleep as deeply that night because you're on edge. And this is for an interview or it's for a critical, like this is a non-negotiable trip that has to happen. You've got to wake up. The second thing is that when you are expecting that wave of sort of a need to wake up, and maybe it's just I'm expecting the phone again, you will wake up just a few minutes before your alarm. It's stunning how many people will say, I had this big flight the next day, and you almost know I'm going to wake up 2 minutes before my alarm goes off. Why? Because your brain has stayed in this shallow state of anticipatory anxiety, and you don't get as much deep sleep. And we've now demonstrated that, we and others. When you have that low level of anxiety, the depth of your deep sleep is not as deep. You don't get the good. So again, not to be trying to dictate what people do, just be aware that when you do create that behavior and that regiment, it becomes all. So that was, I think, a brilliant causal manipulation. The problem is that most of us don't have access to a sort of come to bed eyes thermal suit. So what can we do as a consequence? Please don't cut that. I'll get myself into terrible trouble, rightly so. I should be punished.
You'll be all right.
What they did then was to say, well, okay, let's look at this. Is there something that we could do that's cheaper and more accessible to the general public? And if you look, there's a literature that preceded that manipulation. And it's so reliable that we now have a term for it in sleep science. It's called the warm bath effect. And many people will say, look, I love to have a warm bath or a hot shower before bed. And I think when I get out, I'm nice and toasty. And it's because I'm nice and warm that I fall asleep and I stay asleep. It's the exact opposite. When you get out of the warm bath or the shower, you have once again vasodilated at the surface of your skin. You get out of the bath, you get this huge thermal dump of heat away from the core. What happens? You fall asleep and you stay asleep more soundly. Now, there are other reasons that has a benefit. It's relaxing, you decompress, you're staying away from technology, etc. But that is one of the thermal benefits. And in fact, there were studies by a legend in my field who passed away just a few years ago, Jim Horn at Loughborough University in the UK. And they did some of these pioneering studies. They were able to improve the amount of deep sleep by almost 40 minutes in some individuals. What was the protocol there? As I recall, I think they were in the bath for somewhere around, or the bath duration time was somewhere around 30 minutes, but they were doing sort of segments where it was, maybe it was 40 minutes, 10 minutes in, and then you could sort of get out. I think the temperature, because it was UK, was around about 40 degrees Celsius, somewhere in that region. I may be getting those numbers wrong because I know we like to protocolize some of this. But they were able to show some really pleasant benefits to deep sleep. It also helped people fall asleep, helped them fall asleep by about 25 minutes faster in those people who were really having a hard time with sleep.
I'm going to take a hot bath tonight. I sometimes do the sauna in the evening before sleep. I'm a big fan of cold in the morning, cold shower, cold plunge in the morning.
Because you're reverse engineering the equation. You're trapping the heat into the core of your body. You're waking yourself up.
Right. And in the evening, I've used sauna. The one issue with sauna is I really crank the heat of the sauna. And then sometimes if you do that right before bed, you take a warmish shower right afterwards, you get into bed. Oftentimes I'll wake up thirsty, and then because it dehydrates you. And then if I drink a lot of water to hydrate after I'm in the sauna, then I'm waking up too much in the middle of the night. So I think sauna is great, but right before bed.
I would love to. I don't have a sauna at home or nor an access to, I mean, there are saunas in and around where I live, but what I want to do is have it proximal to my bedtime. And my bedtime, because I'm a neutral type, sort of around 11-ish, nowhere is open and willing to allow me to sit in the sauna. How long do you sit in there usually?
I'm a little bonkers about this. Well, if it's in the evening and I just want to relax, I would say maybe 20, 30 minutes. And I tend to go really warmer than I want to stay
here. What does Peter do? Peter Attia, our friend. Is he
I've
about
done
the same?
sauna cold plunge with Peter. He usually does it in the evening, goes sauna cold, sauna cold, sauna cold.
Okay.
Warm shower. And I don't know how many nights a week he's doing that. But in terms of the temperature of the sauna, generally somewhere between 175 and 200 10 degrees, depending on how heat adapted you are. But I think a hot bath is great, or a nice hot shower.
Yeah, I've certainly done that.
you
And
know-
when I'm traveling with jet lag, I will absolutely, that's part of my sort of jet lag protocol. I'll make sure because I don't really struggle too much with sleep, at least at present. But when I go through jet lag and I go back home to London, oh, of course it's tough.
The worst. Jet lag's the
Protocolize
worst.
the living daylights out of that and do as much as I can. So I think that's probably the end of the thermal story. Although we are now trying to see if we can take lo-fi approaches where we're going to do some foot warming. We're trying to develop some foot warming technology that can be built into maybe a mattress, and some mattress companies, and there are some great ones. I know, obviously, Matteo at 8 Sleep, and they are doing amazing things. I think his company, again, I have no affiliation, but we connect very well, and he's brilliant. So they're doing something like that.
I do use and love my 8 Sleep. Here's what I'd love somebody to engineer. And we've got a lot of people who listen to the podcast who think about product development. It would be wonderful to have a portable pair of socks so that you can use them when you travel or when you go, sleep anywhere at home or elsewhere, that would warm your feet up at the beginning of the night.
Yep.
So this is a place for us to recap. Warm up to cool down to fall asleep, right? Stay cool to stay asleep, and then warm up in the morning to wake up.
Yeah.
And so that is pretty straightforward to build into a pair of socks. Somebody can do this. Somebody do this.